Beneath the glass vaults of a winter conservatory, laughter cuts like crystal. A tall, awkward illustrator stands alone, until a silent baron halts the room by claiming every one of her drawings. Is it rescue, or the opening move of a bargain neither can afford? Whispers coil through London, a scandal reborn, a past betrayal stirring, and an impossible choice between duty and desire. In the hush that follows, a single look turns into a match struck in the dark, promising light or fire. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, and share, what do you love most about period romances, the simmering glances, the class wars, or the secrets that refuse to stay buried? London, December of 1874. The gas lamps flickered beneath the weight of winter fog, casting halos of amber light across the frost-laced iron gates of the Royal Horticultural Society. Carriages creaked and halted before the grand conservatory as lace-gloved hands emerged from velvet-lined interiors, followed by the trailing hems of silks and satins, bustles and fur-trimmed cloaks, each woman arriving as if she herself were a blossom on display. Laughter clinked like cut crystal in the cold night air. Inside, among the towering palms and warm mist of exotic ferns, the winter fete shimmered like a living dream. Lanterns hung like floating stars above a crowd of London's finest, their voices a murmur of vanity and ambition, the scent of orchids mingled with expensive perfume. It was not a place made for someone like Juniper Jasper, or so the room had already decided. She stood slightly apart at the edge of the glass exhibit hall, where her modest table had been allotted by courtesy, not invitation. Her plum-colored wool dress, carefully brushed and pressed that morning, now felt too warm beneath the overhead gaslights. The black velvet piping, so precisely hand-sewn around the collar and cuffs, was meant to convey dignity. But among gowns of silk fare and beaded trains that rustled like whispered secrets, her outfit seemed almost puritanical. And then there was her height. Juniper Jasper was tall, not merely tall for a woman, but tall in a way that drew glances from across a room, often followed by whispered remarks that lingered longer than footsteps. Her posture, trained over years to fold itself discreetly inward, now failed her. She could feel the stares like cold pins on her back. Behind her, a trio of women fanned themselves while pretending not to speak too loudly. She should have stood behind the table, one simpered. I nearly mistook her for a coat rack, added another. A pity, really. Some of those drawings are quite lovely, if only they hadn't been done by a giraffe. Juniper's hand tightened on the edge of her sketch folio. Her grey-green eyes, cool, precise, unflinching, remained on the paper she was adjusting. The illustration of Passiflora caerulea beneath her fingers was the product of 60 hours' labor, 7 field studies, and 2 nights spent redrawing petal structure by candlelight. It deserved silence. Instead, it received ridicule. She turned slightly, keeping her chin level. "Excuse me," she said, soft but firm, "but your voices do carry." The women tittered and withdrew, their silk skirts swishing like gossip given form. Juniper exhaled, slow and contained. She would endure the night, as she had endured many. But the moment of reprieve did not last. A sudden hush swept across the conservatory, like wind through leaves. A presence entered, not loud, not ostentatious, but commanding. Men straightened their shoulders, women adjusted their gloves. Eyes turned. Baron Jasper Redcliffe of Greymont had arrived. He moved through the crowd with the calm bearing of a man who belonged everywhere and chose carefully where to linger. His charcoal wool coat, tailored within a breath of his form, bore no ornament beyond a silver watch chain and a ring bearing the Greymont crest. His expression, serious, unreadable, did not alter as he passed former lovers, business rivals, and ambitious hostesses. He nodded once, and the room made space for him. Juniper watched him in silence, though her pulse betrayed her stillness. She had seen his likeness in journals, the patron of sciences, the industrialist with a reputation for funding botanical expeditions, the man who spoke little but signed important checks. She had never expected him to attend the fete in person. Nor had she expected him to stop before her table. Baron Greymont looked down, not condescendingly but curiously. His deep-set blue eyes took in the stack of illustrations, lingering on her rendering of a curling fern frond, then a cross-section of a datura bloom. He reached for the sketch of the passion flower. "You drew these?" he asked, his voice low and gravel-edged, refined by restraint. "I did." Juniper's voice was calm, but her throat was dry. "They are exceptional," he said simply. "The detail, the structure, and the shading along the corolla. You understand the subject, not merely how to render it." He paused. "That is rare." She blinked. "Thank you," she managed. He turned to the attendant beside him, a young man in a crisp grey livery. "Send word to Mr. Beach. Purchase everything Miss Locke has brought, all originals, all prints. Frame them for the museum's new south wing." Juniper felt the temperature shift, as though the conservatory had inhaled. "All of them?" the attendant echoed. "Yes," the Baron said without hesitation, "and ensure the name Juniper Locke appears prominently beneath each frame." Someone behind her gasped. The trio of women who had mocked her fell into sudden silence. One dropped her fan. Baron Greymont turned back to her, and for the briefest moment she saw something flicker in his eyes, something neither pity nor calculation. Recognition. "I'll need to speak with you," he said. "This evening, if that's agreeable." She nodded. What else could she do? And he inclined his head before moving on, as though he had merely commented on the weather. When he was gone, the room resumed its hum, but the frequency had changed. Now it buzzed with questions, envy, suspicion. Juniper remained still, her face composed, but inside something shifted. Not pride, she had no use for such things, and not fear exactly. It was curiosity, laced with disbelief. Later that evening, she stood in the study of Greymont House, surrounded by volumes of science, dried herbs pinned in glass, and the quiet ticking of a mantel clock. The room smelled of ink, oak polish, and paper. Baron Redcliffe sat behind his desk, gloved hands resting on an unopened folder. He gestured for her to sit. She did not. "I did not bring you here," he said slowly, "to apologize for the spectacle. "I would not expect you to," she answered, "nor to flatter you. Also unnecessary." He inclined his head in quiet approval. "I brought you here," he continued, "because I have a proposition, one that may serve us both." Juniper waited, still standing, still tall. "My position," he said, "requires the appearance of stability, respectability. A wife." He paused. "You are not an ornament, Miss Locke. But you are discreet, intelligent, and you understand the weight of public scrutiny." She said nothing, but her breath caught, just slightly. "In exchange," he added, "you would receive protection, autonomy, a home, no expectations beyond civility, and your work would be sponsored. A marriage, in name, for purpose, between a baron and a woman mocked for her very presence." The silence stretched between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, deliberate. "You do not know me." "I know what matters," he said. She looked down at her gloved hands, then at the books behind him. A fern, pressed between glass. A passion flower sketch pinned with brass tacks. "I will consider it," she replied. His nod was slow, measured. "I'll expect your answer within the week." She turned to leave. Her boots sounded softly on the polished floor. At the door she hesitated, just long enough for him to look up. Their eyes met, not as artist and patron, not as servant and master, not yet as anything, but something had begun, quiet, incomplete, and impossible to ignore. The morning air over Kew Gardens was tinted with frost, fragile and glistening like sugar on glass. A pale sun struggled behind a veil of low clouds, casting a cold, diffused light across the bare trees and skeletal vines of winter. Even in dormancy, the gardens held a quiet pulse, life tucked beneath bark and soil, sleeping, waiting. It was the kind of silence that did not demand words, a silence that suited Juniper Locke. Wrapped in her charcoal pelisse, the collar turned up against the morning chill, she moved slowly through the path, near the temperate house, her gloved hands tucked in the folds of her cloak. Her boots pressed into the thin crust of frozen earth, each step measured, deliberate. She needed air, she needed distance, she needed to breathe somewhere no one was watching her. The echoes of the winter fete still clung to her skin, like the lingering smoke of a fire. The laughter, the whispers, the astonishment in every glance when the Baron had spoken her name aloud, and then his voice again, calm and clear, offering something she had never imagined. Marriage, not for love, not for passion, not even for companionship, but for alliance, for stability, for protection wrapped in legality and framed in silence. Her fingers curled around the brooch at her throat, the mother-of-pearl cameo carved in profile, the only thing her mother had left her before illness took her away. A reminder of quieter days, hard days, the kind where being different had not made Juniper interesting or desirable, only inconvenient. Now, someone like Baron Jasper Redcliffe, a man who moved through power like a current, had chosen her not in spite of those differences, but because of them. Not for beauty, not for charm, but for her silence, her order, her mind. It stirred something in her, uncertainty perhaps, or the slow dawning of something more dangerous. Footsteps approached. Juniper turned slowly, unsurprised to see Jasper walking along the path behind her, one gloved hand clasped behind his back, the other adjusting his wool coat at the collar. He had no escort, no hat, no need for presentation. Here, away from society's walls, he looked like a man unburdened by title. Almost. "I hoped I might find you here," he said, his voice like low thunder muffled by snow. She did not bow. Instead, she inclined her head. "You assumed correctly." There was a long pause. The wind stirred the branches above them, bare and trembling. "I have never found public settings conducive to clarity," he began, "especially when matters of consequence are at hand." "Nor have I," she replied. He gestured forward, and together they began to walk. The path curved gently through wintering rosebeds and dormant ferns, past the great iron ribs of the palm house, where condensation beaded against glass like 100 tiny hearts. "You are no stranger to solitude," he said, not as a question. "No," she replied, her breath visible between them. "I became acquainted with it quite early." He looked ahead. So did I. She glanced sideways, curious, but his expression remained unreadable. They walked in silence for several paces. Then at the edge of the fernery he stopped. So did she. "I will speak plainly, Miss Locke," he said. "I intend to move forward with the Greymont Museum of Natural Inquiry. Its future depends on public trust and private capital. To secure both, my board insists on a figure of domestic stability, an image they can point to and assure patrons that Greymont is not merely a mind, but a household, a life, a name." She waited. "You are discreet, intelligent, capable, and entirely free of social ambition," he continued. "Qualities I consider valuable. I will not insult you with the language of romance or flattery. What I offer is a contract. I ask for your presence, your partnership, and your silence regarding private matters. In return, you will receive legal protection, residence at Greymont House, full artistic freedom, and unrestricted access to the museum's resources and publishing arm." He turned to face her fully. "There will be no expectation of intimacy, no requirement of performance before the ton. I will ask for nothing beyond civility and discretion." The cold pressed in, but his voice remained steady. And then, softly, he added, "You may of course refuse." Juniper considered him for a long moment. "I have conditions," she said at last. He nodded once. "I will retain the rights to all my work. The illustrations, the journals, the plates. Anything commissioned through the museum may bear your name, but only if mine appears beside it. I will not be erased." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "I will maintain personal income from any work I sell independently." Also agreed. And I will not be expected to wear what society deems fashionable. I will dress according to function and dignity. At this, his mouth curved slightly, barely perceptible. It would be ill-advised for me to challenge someone with your sense of aesthetic. Juniper's eyes narrowed, but not in offense. There was humor beneath his reserve, she realized, dry and rare, like a pressed flower long forgotten in a book. I will also require a door I may lock, she added. He met her gaze directly. You shall have an entire wing. A pause. Then slowly she extended her gloved hand. He took it, holding it briefly, not squeezing, not lingering. Just contact. A shared decision. A contract written not yet in ink, but in silence. The marriage was arranged within 4 days. No announcements were sent, no invitations, no banns read aloud in church pews. The ceremony took place in a quiet legal chamber off Lincoln's Inn, with a single solicitor, 2 staff witnesses, and the smell of lemon oil clinging to the wood-panelled walls. Juniper wore the same plum-coloured wool dress she had worn the night of the fete, altered slightly at the waist by her own needle. She refused the offer of a new gown. A new life would not be built on borrowed lace. Jasper wore a dark morning coat, his gloves immaculate, his hair swept back as always. He did not look at her often, but when he did, his eyes never wavered. There was no kiss, only ink on parchment, a shared nod, and a signature Juniper Lock in sharp strokes across a document that would change her life without touching her skin. That evening, as the last light of day slipped behind the rooftops, Juniper stood alone in her new chamber at Greymont House. The room was large, but not grand. Its windows overlooked a winter garden, and the hearth glowed gently. Her trunks had arrived. A stack of her botanical sketches sat neatly beside a leather-bound folio on the writing desk. She removed her brooch and placed it carefully on the table. Then she stood in silence for several minutes, allowing herself one breath of uncertainty, just one. After that, she straightened her spine, unpinned her hair, and stared into the mirror. She did not look like a wife, nor a baroness. She looked like herself, and that for now would be enough. In another wing of the house, Jasper Redcliffe poured himself a measure of brandy and stared into the fire. The ink on the marriage register was barely dry. They were strangers, now bound by law. And yet, in that silence, something deeper than law had taken root, quiet as winter, unseen as a seed, waiting, watching, becoming. The mist that hovered over Kew Gardens that early February morning was delicate, almost luminous, like the breath of the earth suspended in air. Beneath the gentle weight of condensation, glass domes shimmered like pale jewels, their curved panes beaded with droplets that traced slow, deliberate paths downward. The world inside was warm, fragrant, alive with quiet motion, leaves unfurling, vines stretching, moss darkening with moisture. Here, amid the ferns and orchids, Juniper Lock moved with a purpose that neither questioned nor hurried. Wrapped in a slate-blue working gown, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair pinned in its usual unadorned crown, she catalogued specimens with a focused intensity that made the noise of the world disappear. Her fingers, always gloved in soft brown cotton, handled each stem with reverence. Her pencil danced across vellum, sketching the curling tendrils of a rare Nepalese vine, the ink-smudged notations beside her observations as delicate as the plant itself. Around her, the gentle hum of the herbarium staff buzzed like distant bees. Pages rustled, trays of dried leaves passed from hand to hand, and Miss Martha Trenham, stooped, wiry, with spectacles that magnified her eyes, barked orders without looking up from her ledger. "Label that properly, Mr. Griffiths. If I see another specimen unknown, I'll toss you into the compost heap myself." Juniper did not flinch. She had learned, quickly and quietly, that Miss Trenham respected no one who wilted under tone. Instead, she earned the older woman's trust the only way that mattered in a place like Kew, with precision. By the second week, Miss Trenham spoke less sharply, By the third, she began handing Juniper not just assigned plates but full case files, letting her review specimen records, botanical histories, and dried samples from foreign expeditions. Once, she even muttered, "Sharp eye, that one," when she thought no one heard. Juniper had heard. And in that softest of acknowledgments, she felt something warm stir inside her chest. Children began to gather near her work table in the afternoons, some wide-eyed and curious, others simply bored of being tugged through endless rows of plants. She began speaking softly as she worked, naming herbs and vines with quiet clarity. She told them which leaves could soothe a fever, which flowers opened only at dusk, which stalks curled to protect themselves from harsh winds. They listened, enraptured. No one asked about her height. No one laughed. And though the air was thick with humidity, Juniper breathed easier than she had in weeks. What she did not notice, not at first, was that she was not the only one watching the children. From a distance, just beyond the filmy veil of the temperate house, Baron Jasper Redcliffe observed her through the mottled glass, never intruding, never announcing himself, simply watching. There was something in the way she stood, still and unwavering, that held his attention longer than he expected. The way her hands moved, not with performance, but with certainty. The way she answered the children's questions with a patience most adults could not offer. She did not command the room. She simply earned it. That evening, as the last of the light faded into indigo and the scent of damp moss and citrus lingered in the air, Juniper remained behind. The staff had gone. Even Miss Trenham had disappeared into her study. Alone beneath the domed ceiling, she sat at a wooden bench near the blue passion-flower trellis, a lamp casting a soft golden glow over her work. Her satchel lay open beside her, half full with sketches. On the page before her bloomed a meticulously drawn Passiflora caerulea, its petals unfurled like arms in prayer, tendrils twisting at the edge, the corona of filaments radiating with exacting grace. Juniper leaned forward, one hand steadying the page, the other tracing a pencil along the curve of a sepal. She was so absorbed that she did not hear the footfall behind her. "Your lines are not merely correct," came a voice low and calm. "They are reverent." She turned, startled but not afraid. Jasper stood just beyond the pool of lamplight, the shadows softening the austerity of his features. He had removed his gloves. One rested in his coat pocket, the other hung loosely from his hand. "I didn't hear you," she said, her voice a half-breath. "I didn't want you to." He stepped closer, though not too close. "You were working." She turned her sketchpad slightly, allowing him a better view. "It's nearly complete." He studied it for a moment, then looked at her. "You draw like someone who's been listening to plants all her life." Her lips parted, just barely. It was not flattery, it was observation, and that made it far more dangerous. "Perhaps I have," she replied. The silence between them pulsed, not empty but full of everything unsaid. "Is this your refuge?" he asked, glancing around the greenhouse. "When the world grows too loud?" "No," she said softly, eyes fixed on her page. "This is my voice. Everything else is the noise." He looked at her a long while, and then without a word, he nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, not of title nor status, but of understanding. She felt it like warmth against her collarbone. He turned to go, but just as his silhouette reached the threshold, she looked up and met his gaze. Through the fading light, through the vines and leaves and glass, their eyes locked. His, usually so distant, now soft and unreadable. Hers, steady, open. In that gaze, there was no hierarchy, no expectation, no mask, only recognition. And then he was gone, leaving the scent of damp earth and something else, a breath that did not belong to the plants. By morning, the greenhouse felt different, brighter perhaps, or warmer, or simply full of a presence that lingered just beneath awareness. Juniper kept her thoughts folded tightly within her, but London did not. Later that week, the Morning Register published a new column, thinly veiled under the name of Miss Agatha C., a woman who wrote with powdered claws and ink dipped in arsenic. It was a short piece, just under 500 words, but every syllable cut. What strange winds must blow through the hallowed halls of Kew when a certain baron takes unusual interest in the illustrations of a tall, obscure botanist whose charms lie not in her conversation nor her appearance, but perhaps in her willingness to be useful. Juniper read the article in silence, her tea cooling beside her. She felt no heat rise in her cheeks, no tears, only a slow, deep stillness. She folded the paper in half, then again, and again, until it disappeared into the folds of her satchel. That afternoon she returned to Kew. She did not wear plum, she wore green, deep as ivy, and stood taller than she ever had. The chandeliers of the Albion Hall, glittering with 100 beeswax tapers, cast a soft golden haze over the assembled donors. Crystal glasses clinked, silver cutlery whispered against porcelain, and the murmur of carefully moderated laughter rose like the tide beneath a string quartet's restrained performance. Outside, London's streets lay cloaked in fog and coal smoke, but within these walls, warmth and privilege coiled like a rare perfume. The dinner, honouring the museum's benefactors, had been designed to impress, to reassure patrons of the stability of the Greymont name and its grand project. Yet for Juniper Locke, the night already pressed against her like a corset laced too tightly. She stood near a marble column at the edge of the grand dining room, her deep moss-green gown a deliberate choice, neither ostentatious nor meek. The high neckline and fitted bodice emphasized her slender form without apology, and a single mother-of-pearl brooch glimmered faintly at her throat. She had pinned her hair more severely than usual in an attempt at invisibility, but her height rendered all such efforts futile. The whispers had begun before she even entered the room. That must be her, the Baron's odd choice. Tall as a footman, their words slid over her like cold water. She had learned not to flinch, yet tonight, under the chandeliers and in the company of people who could fund or ruin the museum with a single whim, the scrutiny cut deeper. She folded her hands and fixed her gaze on the far end of the hall, where Jasper Redcliffe stood among a cluster of trustees, his dark frock coat immaculate, his expression measured. He gave no sign of discomfort, yet she saw the slight tightening at the corner of his jaw each time someone's eyes flicked from him to her and back again. Juniper drew a slow breath. The scent of lilies and polished wood mingled with something sweeter, heavier approaching behind her. She turned and found herself looking into the hazel eyes of Mrs. Agatha Clevedon. The older woman glided forward like a ship under full sail, a gown of deep mauve satin sweeping the parquet floor. Her bodice was trimmed with black jet beads that caught the candlelight in tiny glints of fire. A hat, festooned with pheasant feathers, tilted at a daring angle, and a cloud of heady perfume, amber and crushed violets, preceded her like a herald. She extended a gloved hand, her smile soft as butter but sharp as a blade concealed beneath it. "My dear Miss Locke," she cooed, her voice warm honey drizzled over steel. "At last we meet. I have heard so very much about you." Juniper inclined her head, accepting the hand without haste. "Mrs. Clevedon, the pleasure is mine." "Is it?" Mrs. Clevedon's eyes glimmered as if at a private jest. "I do hope you find our little gatherings pleasant. These halls can be daunting for someone unaccustomed to them." Juniper's fingers tightened slightly over her own wrist, beneath the folds of her skirt. "The plants at Kew can be far more intimidating," she said evenly. "At least they do not pretend otherwise." A faint lift of Clevedon's eyebrows, no more than a flicker, acknowledged the rebuke. "How charming," she murmured, "and how very instructive for the children you entertain there. I am told you have a special talent for simplicity." Juniper allowed a thin smile. "I prefer clarity." "Of course." Mrs. Clevedon's gaze drifted over Juniper's shoulders toward the cluster of donors whispering near the champagne table. "Clarity can be a virtue, or a liability. It depends on who holds the glass." The feathers of her hat trembled as she leaned closer, perfume enveloping Juniper in a sweet, stifling cloud. "I should warn you, my dear, society does not forgive women who overreach, but perhaps you already know that." Juniper did not step back. Her voice was quiet, level. "I know society rarely forgives women at all." Mrs. Clevedon's smile deepened, but her eyes cooled. "How bold. We shall enjoy one another, I think." With a soft laugh, she drifted away, trailing scent and murmurs in her wake. Juniper remained very still, feeling as if the exchange had left a faint residue on her skin. She lifted her gaze and found Jasper watching her from across the room. For an instant, their eyes met, his guarded, hers steady. Then he turned back to the trustees, his posture like marble. The dinner proceeded with the delicate choreography of high society. Silver domes lifted to reveal quail glazed in wine. The quartet shifted to a softer movement, and footmen moved like shadows between tables. Juniper sat at the edge of the long dining arrangement, her name card written in precise copperplate, placed at a remove from the Baron's seat. Conversations swirled around her but seldom toward her. The donors spoke of shipping contracts, railway expansions and colonial expeditions. Occasionally someone glanced at her sketches displayed in the adjoining gallery, but their remarks were murmured behind raised napkins. Midway through the third course, a burst of laughter at the far end of the table signaled the arrival of Ellis Havisham. He was plump in his waistcoat of striped satin, a gold chain stretching across his belly like a challenge. His hairline had retreated, but his voice had not. Loud, jovial, a man performing affability while counting coins beneath the table. He bowed extravagantly to Mrs. Clevedon, then to the patrons nearest him, his eyes sliding over Juniper with a flicker of amusement. "Ah," he declared, "the famous Miss Locke. I have heard you are quite the revelation at Kew. And now, at our dear Baron's side, tell me, does the passion flower draw passion?" The pun landed with a ripple of smirks from his companions. Juniper's jaw tightened, but her expression remained composed. "It draws pollinators," she said softly. "Creatures who mistake mimicry for truth." Havisham chuckled, but his gaze sharpened for a moment before he turned to refill his glass. As dessert was served, the whispers grew. Juniper felt them like invisible threads, weaving a net around her. Odd stature, provincial manners, the Baron's experiment. Each phrase floated across the candlelit air like ash. Jasper, seated several places away, gave no outward sign. But his fork paused once mid-air, and his eyes, when they flicked to her, held a muted fire. Yet he remained silent, bound by the necessity of restraint. Any defense now would only feed the columnists. Juniper understood. She did not want his rescue, but she could not stop the ache of isolation. After the toasts and the polite applause, she excused herself under the pretext of needing air. The corridors beyond the ballroom were dimmer, lined with oil paintings and heavy draperies. The murmur of conversation faded, replaced by the muted creak of her boots on polished wood. She passed a half-open door and slowed. Voices, low, conspiratorial. "Ruined her," one said, feminine and laced with triumph. "Fed the papers just enough. She never showed her face again." A male chuckle. "And now you have another in your sights?" A pause. Then Mrs. Clevedon's voice, unmistakable. "Men like the Baron think themselves untouchable. They forget how fragile reputation can be. I taught his darling fiancé that lesson once. Perhaps I shall teach it again." Juniper's pulse thudded. She leaned slightly nearer, hidden behind the velvet drape. Another voice murmured agreement, but she no longer heard the words, only the meaning. So it was true. Jasper's restraint, his caution, the shadow in his gaze, born of betrayal. Betrayal engineered by the same woman now dripping sweetness over Juniper's name. She straightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. A slow, cold clarity slid through her like water under ice. She stepped back quietly, her boots making no sound, and turned down the corridor before they could sense her presence. In the empty antechamber beyond, she stopped and pressed her palm flat against the cool marble wall. Her reflection stared back at her from a gilt mirror, tall, severe, eyes shining not with tears, but with something sharper, resolve. When she returned to the hall a few minutes later, the music had resumed, and the donors were laughing over brandied coffee. Mrs. Clevedon was back at her seat, her feathers nodding with each polished tilt of her head. Ellis Havisham was pouring himself another glass, his smile wide and false. Juniper walked past them without slowing. As she reached her place at the table, she felt Jasper's gaze on her. She met it, holding it for a single heartbeat. She did not speak, but in that silent exchange something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, of shared knowledge not yet voiced. She sat, lifted her glass and sipped slowly, tasting not wine, but the bitter sweetness of understanding. The perfume of malice still hung in the air, but beneath it a new current had begun to rise, quiet, unseen, gathering its own force. The February air hung thick with moisture beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Kew specimen vault, where cold stone met glass and order was measured in rows of iron cabinets and catalogue tags. It was here, beneath lock and key, that the most dangerous and delicate plants were stored, those too volatile, too rare, or too misunderstood to remain in public view. Only the trained staff, with signed access ledgers and the proper gloves, could step into this sanctum without risk. Juniper Locke, in her usual working gown of muted grey wool, moved through the narrow aisles with practiced steps. The lamplight flickered against the brass nameplates, casting long shadows. She carried a tray lined with soft linen, ready to return a sample of dried Taxus baccata, yew bark, to its assigned drawer. The air was still, fragrant with dried resin and moss. A silence that usually soothed her nerves now felt taut, as if the walls themselves anticipated some tremor of disturbance. Miss Martha Trenham had not spoken much that morning, save for a sharp "careful" when an apprentice dropped a jar of spores. Juniper had taken no offence. The herbarium hummed with tension, and the reason revealed itself just past the second hour. "Has anyone seen Aconitum ferox?" asked Mr. Beach, arriving with a folded paper and a face set in stone. Juniper turned. "It's in Vault 2, Case 7, second shelf, locked." "It was," he replied. "It's not anymore." A pause fell, sudden and absolute. Miss Trenham froze. "Impossible." "It was reported missing this morning. After the outer vault was opened under clearance for delivery review, the keys were signed out by Miss Locke 2 days ago." All eyes turned to her. Juniper's heart did not race. Her breathing did not quicken. She merely set down the tray with care. "I returned the keys the same afternoon," she said, "and replaced the plant as instructed. I noted the time, 4:22. Mr. Beach nodded. "So your signature confirms, but the specimen is gone, and the records say you were the last to access it." Miss Trenham cursed under her breath and pulled off her gloves with a snap. "This is nonsense. She's more careful than the rest of you combined." But Mr. Beach had no expression of comfort. "Regulations require a full internal investigation. Inspectors from the society arrive tomorrow." The words landed like frost on open skin. Juniper, composed, turned to her desk and gathered her things. "I'll prepare my documentation." By evening, the news had begun to spread, not through official reports, but through whispers sharpened by ink. The next morning, the Morning Register printed a new piece under the social column, "Botanical Beauty or Menace." It was unsigned, but unmistakably penned by Mrs. Agatha Clevedon. "It is troubling indeed that such rare and lethal specimens may vanish under the nose of those deemed qualified, particularly when those newly introduced to the circles of science are also newly introduced to its patrons." The insinuation was poison itself. That afternoon, Jasper Redcliffe arrived unannounced at the herbarium, a chill in his coat and thunder behind his eyes. Juniper looked up from her desk, where she had been revising her vault logs in tidy ink. "They're calling for your removal," he said without preamble. "The Society Board. They're frightened. And Havisham—" "I know," she said, closing her journal. "He's begun offering safe storage for the more controversial specimens." Jasper paced once across the stone floor, the echo of his boots bouncing off the glass panels. "They want a formal apology," he added, "or at least a withdrawal from public responsibilities." She stood slowly. Her hands rested against the table. "You came here to ask me to step aside." He stopped. "No." She raised her eyes to him. "Then why?" His gaze met hers, full of something unspoken, frustration perhaps, or worry, wrapped too tightly around his sense of control. "To help," he said. "If I make a statement, if I bring the trustees into a private meeting, they'll say you're protecting your wife. Would that be so terrible? For me?" Her voice cracked softly. "Yes." He looked at her then, not as baron to wife, but man to woman. A woman with the spine to stand under the weight of public scorn without bending. "I won't let them humiliate you," he said quietly. "They already have," she replied, "but I will not let them define me." Silence stretched between them like a bridge in fog. Finally, he nodded once tightly and left her to her work. The next day the investigators arrived. They were precise men with dull eyes and leather folios. They asked their questions methodically. Juniper answered them with calm precision. The vault logs matched, her timings aligned. Her sketches of the aconitum ferox, drawn before its return, were the most detailed on record. Still, they remained unconvinced. "Many forgeries begin with accurate records," said one. On the third day, her satchel was searched. Without warning, during a mid-morning audit, the lead inspector requested her bag. She handed it over without flinching. He opened it on the work table before the others, her sketchbook, her spare pencils, her pressed samples of moss, and a folded paper marked with the Greymont seal. "What's this?" he asked. "My observation notes," she said. He unfolded it, reviewed it, said nothing, but Miss Trenham, standing nearby, muttered darkly, "If she were a man, you'd ask her for her expertise, not her bag." Juniper said nothing. The ache in her throat had begun to settle deeper than where words could reach. Later that evening, when the vault was closed and the herbarium finally silent, she lingered in the palm house, the glass fogged with condensation. The scent of life pressed in around her, earth and chlorophyll, waxy petals and moist bark. She stood before the empty shelf in Vault 2, Case 7, second row. Gone. Just gone. She pressed her hand to the wooden frame, as though the memory of the plant might remain in the grain. Behind her, a faint sound. She turned, half expecting Jasper, but the figure that emerged from the shadows was not his. It was Ellis Havisham. He tipped his hat in mock civility. "Forgive the intrusion. I was told the house was closed." "It is," Juniper said coldly. "I merely came to observe," he said, stepping closer, eyes gleaming. "Such a shame, this scandal. So avoidable. A woman of your talents deserves better than suspicion." She didn't answer. He smiled wider. "You know, my storage facility on Fleet Lane offers discretion, protection. Perhaps the Baron would prefer his more volatile assets handled with less public scrutiny." Juniper stared at him. "You mean your facility offers immunity to theft?" His smile did not falter. "Let's not be so crude." She stepped forward. "Tell your clients that I may be tall, but I hear everything from above." He inclined his head with a chuckle. "So you do." And then he left, his boots silent over the stone path. Juniper stood alone, heart hammering, resolve hardening. The plant had not vanished, it had been taken, and she would find out by whom, not for pride, not for honor, but for truth, and for every woman ever called dangerous simply because she knew too much. The rain fell in soft, stubborn sheets against the windows of Juniper's flat above the apothecary, blurring the panes until the world beyond became watercolor. It was the kind of grey London afternoon that pressed itself against the skin, heavy and without apology. But inside, her desk was illuminated by the warm, unwavering glow of an oil lamp. and her thoughts were sharper than ever. Her fingers, smudged with graphite and ink, moved swiftly across the work table. The sketch of the aconitum ferox, drawn 3 weeks prior, lay beside a recent duplicate submitted anonymously to the Society Board. To the untrained eye, they were identical. But Juniper's eyes had never been ordinary. She sat back, reached into the drawer, and removed her magnifying lens, a brass-rimmed circle worn smooth with use. Holding it just above the surface of the newer illustration, she leaned in, her brow furrowed with meticulous intent. She had copied countless botanical specimens in her career, and she knew how a line should behave, how it curved, how it pressed, how it bled ever so slightly at the edge of absorbent paper. But here, something betrayed the illusion. The stippling around the lower sepals, an almost imperceptible pattern she had noted instinctively in her first rendering, was wrong. Not absent, but uniform, as if printed from a plate, not hand-drawn. The ink behaved differently as well, too even in weight, too precise, mechanical. Her pulse quickened, but she remained still. This was no accident. It was forgery. Careful not to smudge either sheet, she reached for the sample she'd been given to sketch the week of the disappearance, the original. Turning it gently beneath the lens, she confirmed it. The fine texture of the sepals, the subtle veining, the curvature of the stalk, her rendering had matched a living specimen. The forgery matched nothing. Someone had replaced the true aconitum ferox with a fabricated sample, hoping no one would notice. But someone had. She exhaled, slow and measured, before pulling another sheet from her folio, the backing of the forged sketch. Holding it up to the lamplight, she narrowed her eyes. The watermark barely visible in the paper grain was a distinctive one, a stylized lyre encircled by laurel leaves. She knew that mark. It belonged to Bellamy & Sons, a discreet but prolific engraving house on Fleet Street, known for their work in menus, certificates, and, more recently, exhibit labels and botanical reproductions. They were also rumored to be in Ellis Havisham's employ. A thought flickered, a possibility, a connection. She set the pages aside with the reverence of a priestess storing relics. The truth was now a thread between her fingers, and she would pull it, no matter where it led. That evening, the sky remained heavy, the rain reduced to mist. She descended the narrow stairwell to fetch tea, her cloak thrown over her shoulders. The street was quiet, the fog swallowing sound and distance. But as she reached the door, she stopped short. Her front door was defaced. Slashed across the wood in thick black paint was a crude caricature. A towering woman in a wedding dress, her limbs grotesquely elongated, eyes wide and blank, with the word giantess scrawled beneath in jagged strokes. Below it, the remains of her latest illustration portfolio had been shredded and nailed like a warning across the frame. She stood very still. For a moment, the only sound was the distant call of a carriage bell. Then slowly, she stepped back inside. She did not weep. She did not tremble. But something inside her, something quiet and precious, coiled in pain. Within an hour, a sharp knock came at the door. She opened it to find Jasper, his coat soaked through, his jaw set hard as stone. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, and his gloves were clenched in one hand. She said nothing, only motioned toward the door. He took in the destruction, his face tightening with each new detail. "I'll double the security," he said. "I'll send men to guard the building tonight." "No," she said firmly. He turned to her, incredulous. "No? I don't want your guards, Jasper. I want the truth." "You think I don't?" His voice rose. "They painted your door like you were a circus act. They nailed your work to the wall like trophies. What would you have me do? Stand aside and let them do worse?" She faced him fully, her hands clenched at her sides. "I would have you let me fight my own battle." He stared at her, chest rising, breath controlled with difficulty. "You don't have to prove anything to them." "Yes, I do," she said, her voice breaking. "Not because I owe them, but because I owe myself. I've spent my life being looked at like a mistake in scale. Too tall, too quiet, too something. And now that I have finally carved a place in this world, they want to reduce me to a scandal, a headline, a joke. Jasper stepped closer, his voice dropping. You are not a joke. She met his eyes, her own gaze fierce and shining. Then let me show them that. He hesitated, then spoke slowly. I know it was Clevedon and Havisham. I know what they did to the woman I once intended to marry. Her breath caught. He had never spoken of her before. She trusted someone she shouldn't, he said, each word measured. And they used her, shamed her, destroyed her. I did nothing to stop it then. I won't make the same mistake again. His vulnerability lay bare before her, not theatrical, not rehearsed, but raw. It stirred something deeper than sympathy. She stepped forward, her fingers trembling as they reached for his sleeve, not to restrain, but to connect. You're not making a mistake now, she said softly. But if you try to protect me from everything, you'll only make them right. That I'm fragile, that I need shelter, that I didn't earn my place beside you. His eyes searched hers, and what passed between them was not yet forgiveness, nor even agreement, but recognition. That they were no longer two people tied by paper and purpose. They were something more dangerous. Two souls circling the same wound. Jasper exhaled. His voice dropped. You are the most capable woman I've ever known. And I need to prove it, she whispered. The silence between them was thick with tension, but not the brittle kind. It was charged, vibrant, aching to become something else. He nodded once, stepping back. I'll speak to no one, he said, but if you need me, truly need me, I'll be there before the ink dries. She nodded, a single tear slipping silently down her cheek. Not from fear, from fury, from strength, from the knowledge that she would not be erased. And that this time, the woman with the magnifier had seen enough to begin unraveling every thread. The scent of varnished wood and drying plaster lingered in the unfinished halls of the Greymont Museum of Natural Inquiry, mingling with traces of dust and damp stone. By day, the half-built gallery brimmed with carpenters, curators, and crates. But by night, when the hammers ceased and the lamps dimmed, the place took on the hush of a cathedral not yet consecrated. It was here, beneath a ceiling still open to scaffolding, between stacked crates marked fossil fragments, Sierra de Guadarrama and diatom samples, Nile Delta, that Juniper Locke found herself alone, almost. Her boots echoed faintly on the tiled floor, her long figure half illuminated by the flame of a single brass candle holder resting atop a crate. Outside the great windows, ivy clung stubbornly to the stone facade, curling into corners where the masonry hadn't yet been sealed. The evening sky beyond was clear and vast, a blue-black velvet scattered with silver stars. Inside, the shadows moved softly, inviting honesty in a way that crowded parlors and polished salons never could. She sat atop a crate, her wool skirt arranged neatly, her gloved hands resting on her lap. The lamplight cast a warm sheen over her cheekbones, highlighting the serious tilt of her mouth. She looked up only when she heard footsteps, measured, familiar. Jasper Redcliffe entered slowly, his coat open, his collar loosened. He did not wear the stiffness of society tonight. His silhouette was softened by the hour, less barren and more man. A man carrying weight he had not been taught to name. I didn't think you'd come, Juniper said softly. I didn't think I could stay away, he answered. He approached and stopped just a few feet from her, glancing around at the makeshift sanctuary they had both sought out without coordination. Dust floated between them, swirling in the amber light like fireflies. I couldn't sleep, she admitted, folding and unfolding the hem of her glove. Too many thoughts pressing on my ribs. Jasper nodded slowly. This place isn't finished, and yet it already feels like the only corner of London not watching us. They both fell silent. And then, after a moment, he sat across from her, on a crate marked Exotic Barks, Java. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. There was a time, he began, his voice low, when I thought I had already lived the most humiliating chapter of my life. I was 28, engaged to the daughter of a viscount, a woman who had no patience for books but every talent for performance. I mistook flattery for fondness. I mistook proximity for trust. Juniper said nothing, but her gaze held his with quiet encouragement. She was clever, he continued, not in the way you're clever, not with her hands or her eyes or her pen. She was clever with people, their ambitions, their secrets. She liked to stir the water and watch what surfaced. He inhaled slowly, as if drawing breath from the very foundation of the room. She told a story, a lie, to Mrs. Clevedon, about something I'd said, something cruel, supposedly. Mrs. Clevedon printed it in her column before ever asking me if it was true. My name was mocked in every parlour for a season. The engagement was dissolved within a fortnight. She married a banker in Bath 3 months later. Juniper felt her chest tighten, not from shock, but from recognition. The rawness in his voice was not bitterness. It was something worse, disappointment that had calcified into silence over the years. "And you said nothing?" she asked gently. "I thought silence would preserve dignity," he said. "But it didn't. It just let the lie breathe longer." She leaned back against a column. "Why are you telling me this now?" His eyes lifted to hers. "Because I can feel the same pattern unfolding, different stories, same tactics, and I won't let you be pulled apart by the same hands that tore me down." Juniper's heart beat louder in her ears. She rose slowly, walking toward one of the half-finished windows. Ivy trailed along the ledge, backlit by moonlight. Her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, taller, perhaps, but wearier and older. "I was 11, she said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. "When my father stopped looking at me like a daughter and started looking at me like a burden." She turned toward him. He remained seated, watching her with absolute stillness. "My mother was small and soft and delicate," she continued. "My father liked to say she could balance teacups on her wrists, but She laughed once, mirthless. "I was always taller than the other girls. By 13, taller than most of the boys. The neighbours began to whisper that I'd never marry, that I'd grow into a governess or a spinster or a tragedy. My father left the same year, no letter, just the emptiness of his coat not hanging by the door." Jasper rose, but did not approach. "My mother never made me feel ashamed of my body, but the world did. Everywhere I walked, people stared. I folded myself inward, made myself smaller, quieter, invisible." She turned back toward the window. "And then I discovered plants. Things that grew because they were meant to grow. Things that reached for light unapologetically. Jasper's voice, when it came, was thick with something unspoken. And now the world mocks you again for being seen." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He stepped closer, carefully, slowly. "You're not too tall," he said. She looked up at him, startled. "You're not too serious, or too strange, or too quiet, or too much of anything." His words hung between them like suspended breath. "You are exactly what the world never expected," he said. "And that terrifies them." Her eyes burned, but she blinked the tears back. "You sound as if you're not afraid." "I am," he said, "but not of you." A silence fell, tender and devastating. He reached for her hand, slowly, so she could refuse him if she wished. She didn't. Their fingers touched, a hesitant press, nothing more, but it was enough to shift the axis of the moment. She stepped toward him until the fabric of her skirt brushed his trousers. He lifted his other hand to her cheek, barely touching, as if afraid she might vanish beneath his fingers. "Juniper," he said, almost a whisper. She closed her eyes, leaning into his palm. "I don't know what this is." "Neither do I," he admitted, "but I think it might be the beginning of something that matters." He bent forward and kissed her. It was not urgent, not consuming. It was slow, deliberate. Two minds finding silence, two hearts finding breath. The kind of kiss that did not demand but asked. When they parted, their foreheads rested together, the candle flickering behind them. Neither made promises, but they stayed there, beneath ivy and stars, not as baron and wife, not as scandal and shame, but as two quiet souls who had found at last someone who did not look away. The great hall of the Royal Horticultural Society, usually a space reserved for lectures and dignified discussions on soil acidity and rare alpine blooms, now held the electric stillness of a courtroom. Beneath its high, vaulted ceilings, gas chandeliers hissed faintly, their light too gentle to soften the sharpness of tension in the air. Dozens of chairs, arranged in sober rows, were already filled, some by respected members of the society, others by curious onlookers, patrons, trustees, and the occasional reporter lurking at the back with ink-stained cuffs. But all eyes drifted again and again to the woman who stood near the dais, her frame tall and unwavering. Juniper Locke wore no colour to please the crowd. Her gown was a deep charcoal, high-necked, with only the glint of her mother's brooch at her throat. Her hair was neatly pinned, not fashionably, but with the firm discipline of a mind focused not on appearance, but on purpose. She did not fidget. She did not smile. And when her name was called, she stepped forward with the composure of someone who had weathered ridicule, suspicion, and violation, and chosen not to cower. Behind her, seated in the shadows of the second row, Jasper Redcliffe, Baron Greymont, sat with his gloved hands resting on his lap. He did not speak. He did not move. But the storm behind his calm gaze was palpable. He had offered to open the proceedings. She had declined. This was her reckoning, and hers alone. The president of the society, an elderly man with silver side whiskers and a habit of clearing his throat 3 times before speaking, struck the gavel gently against the table. This emergency assembly has been called to address the alleged mishandling, disappearance, and possible forgery of a classified specimen from the Kew collection, namely Aconitum ferox, under the care of Mrs. Juniper Locke Redcliffe, current acting consultant and illustrator to the Greymont Museum of Natural Inquiry. There was a rustle of movement. Juniper took a breath. "I am not here," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the hall, "to defend myself with sentiment. I'm here with facts, observations, records, and truth." She turned, lifting a folio from the table beside her. Her gloves, removed with calm care, rested folded atop her notes. 2 days before the plant's disappearance, I completed an illustrated plate of the Aconitum ferox based on the live specimen retrieved from our high-security vault. It was returned at 4:22 in the afternoon, logged, signed. The sketch was completed that same evening, as seen here. She held up the drawing, a breathtakingly precise rendering, every filament, every petal curl, recorded in her clean, decisive lines. Following the accusation that the specimen had vanished under my care, a new rendering was submitted anonymously to the board. A forgery, I now know. She stepped closer to the center of the room and lifted the second sketch, holding it side by side with her own. To the untrained eye, they appear identical. But beneath magnification, the stippling here, she pointed, her fingertip hovering over the base of the stem, is too uniform, too exact. Ink does not behave like this underhand, but it does beneath plate press. She laid the images down before the front table, where the president leaned forward with narrowed eyes, followed by several other board members murmuring behind their spectacles. Juniper continued. The forgery was printed on Bellamy & Sons Watermark Stock, a papermaker on Fleet Street, known for commercial engravings and exhibit materials. This watermark, she withdrew a thin sheet from her satchel, holding it up to the chandelier, is visible under light. A whisper spread across the room, and then the president nodded to the steward. "Bring forth the witness." The door at the back opened. A young dock worker, his shoulders too broad for the suit someone had lent him, entered hesitantly. A visible rash spread across his left cheek and neck, evidence of exposure to some irritant. He bowed awkwardly. "State your name." "Thomas Browning, sir." "Your statement?" The young man cleared his throat. "I was unloading crates 2 weeks back. Bellamy and Sons, Fleet Lane. One of them cracked open, smelled wrong, like crushed almonds and vinegar. My skin flared up. Doctor said it was a reaction to a toxic specimen. Said I could have died if I'd inhaled too much." Gasps echoed from the gallery. "Do you recognize this label?" Juniper asked gently, lifting a sample plate with the Greymont crest. "No, ma'am," he replied. "The ones I seen had a different seal, laurel ring, stylized lyre in the middle, same as on the paper you showed." Juniper turned to the panel. The same lyre seen in Havisham's museum pamphlets. There was a shuffling near the front. Mrs. Agatha Clevedon, seated in an elaborate plume-covered hat, leaned toward her neighbor with her lips pressed in disapproval. But she said nothing until the president gestured to the steward again, "Bring forward the engraver." A second man entered. Middle-aged, ink-stained fingers, nervous sweat at his temples. He would not meet Juniper's eyes. "You are employed by Bellamy and Sons?" the president asked. "I am." "Did you produce botanical prints using Greymont's designs?" The man shifted. "Not directly, but you reproduced labels similar to theirs?" Yes. I was told they were authorized copies." "By whom?" A long pause, and then he spoke, voice hollow. "Mrs. Clevedon. She paid for the order in cash, said it was for educational distribution." The silence was deafening. All eyes turned to Mrs. Clevedon, who lifted her chin with exquisite poise. "Such accusations are beneath contempt," she said, standing. "I support many causes. It is not my responsibility to monitor every request I approve." "And yet," Juniper said, her voice calm, "this is your cardstock. I retrieved it from the forgery. You'll see, gentlemen." She lifted a final slip of thick paper, held it to the light. "Your laurel lyre, embossed in gold. Used only in your personal correspondence, I'm told." Mrs. Clevedon paled, her hand tightening on the handle of her parasol. "You cannot prove I knew what was being done." Juniper met her gaze. "Perhaps not. But you knew enough to smear me with your pen before facts were known, and that too is a kind of poison." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. The president leaned back, his fingers steepled before him. "The council will now vote," he said, turning to the seated members. One by one, hands lifted, for the censure of Mr. Ellis Havisham. A unanimous show of hands. For the suspension of Mrs. Agatha Clevedon's publication privileges and official endorsement. Another unanimous vote. Juniper exhaled only then, quietly, slowly. The weight on her chest did not vanish, but shifted, no longer a stone pressing her down, but a stone beneath her feet, anchoring her in place. As the assembly began to disperse, voices buzzing with opinions and embarrassment, Juniper stepped away from the dais. She scanned the crowd, and there, among the watching faces, was a woman she had once admired, Lady Pomfret, a regular contributor to the Society's newsletter, once a mentor of sorts. The older woman met Juniper's gaze and lowered her eyes, not in shame for Juniper, but for herself. Juniper turned, only then feeling the warmth of another gaze on her. Jasper remained seated, unmoved from his place, but his expression had shifted. Pride flickered behind his restraint, as if he were watching the unveiling of a monument he had waited a lifetime to see. But he did not rise, he did not speak, he let her have the moment alone, because it was hers, entirely hers. And for the first time in a very long time, Juniper Locke stood in a room full of power and did not feel like an exception. She felt like the proof. The morning of the opening dawned with an amber glow that spilled over the wrought-iron balconies of London's South Kensington district, gilding the newly completed facade of the Greymont Museum of Botany and Natural Curiosities. Its limestone walls gleamed beneath the pale spring sun, and carriages lined the avenue in numbers unseen since the last royal procession. Gas lamps, freshly polished, winked like jewels above a sea of well-dressed guests arriving in silks and tailcoats, their expressions oscillating between curiosity and skepticism. Inside, the museum pulsed with a quiet electricity, like the hush before a storm of applause. Juniper Balogh stood in the west wing, where a golden plaque gleamed at the entrance to the gallery that bore her name. The Balogh Conservatory, an illustrated journey through the kingdom of plants. She wore a gown of deep forest green silk, simple in cut, but regal in its drape. The colour brought out the warm undertones of her skin and the russet flecks in her hazel eyes. Her hair was swept into a low twist at the nape of her neck, held by an ivory comb carved in the shape of an orchid. Her own design, gifted by the museum's staff. There was no plum-coloured wool in sight. That woman, the one who had once hunched her shoulders to seem smaller, who had flushed beneath the stares of cruel society women, was nowhere to be found. The gallery bloomed around her like a living painting. British hedgerows unfolded into alpine meadows, then morphed into dense Amazonian underbrush, each transition seamless, each specimen labelled in her meticulous hand. Her illustrations, pressed and mounted behind delicate panes of museum-grade glass, seemed to breathe. Viewers paused to marvel at the glistening veins of a calla lily, the trembling filaments of a passion flower, the ferocious beauty of a Himalayan blue poppy. Children gathered in knots, recalling her lectures at Kew, pointing out leaves they had once touched under her guidance. Elderly scholars murmured in appreciation, and donors with monocles and diamond brooches leaned closer to the brass plaques bearing the name J. Locke. From the far end of the room, behind a Corinthian column, Jasper Redcliffe observed her. He had arrived early before the guests to ensure every gallery was in place, every light tested. But now he remained motionless, his eyes not on the exhibits but on Juniper. She moved with a serene command, smiling graciously, answering questions with quiet eloquence. She was no longer merely a wife in name. She had become the soul of the institution he had once envisioned alone. Now it was hers just as much as his. The ceremony began at noon in the central rotunda. A cascade of white orchids descended from the atrium skylight, their petals dancing in the breeze, stirred by the gathered crowd. Jasper, standing at the dais, offered brief words on preservation, beauty, and science, then stepped aside. Juniper stepped forward to polite applause, but as her gaze swept across the crowd, it caught on a figure in the back row. Mrs. Agatha Clevedon. Draped in violet silk and too many feathers for a daytime event, she sat rigid, her lips pressed into a bitter line. No one spoke to her. Even the press, who had once printed her every careless word, averted their eyes. The silence surrounding her was louder than any public rebuke. Juniper did not falter. Instead, she smiled. Not a triumphant smile, nor a vindictive one, but the kind that blooms when one knows who they are and who they are not. "I would like to thank," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the rotunda, "the children of Kew Gardens who once asked me if vines could climb even in the dark. They can, and they do." A few soft gasps were heard. Miss Trenham, standing to the side, dabbed at her eyes discreetly. And to those who doubted the purpose of a gallery dedicated to the quiet labour of illustration, I say this: sometimes what is drawn with ink reveals more than what is shouted from pulpits. The applause that followed was thunderous. As the final speaker approached the podium, a silver-haired dowager countess known for her stingy donations, a murmur swept through the assembly. "I have changed my mind," the woman announced, her voice sharp and clear. "I was once courted by a certain gentleman who assured me that nothing good could come of this museum. But today I pledge the entire Westchester endowment to the Greymont Foundation. Let it grow wild if it must, but let it grow with truth." It was a blow to Ellis Havisham from which he would not recover. When the ceremony concluded, guests filtered into adjoining salons, drawn by champagne and curiosity. Juniper lingered behind, allowing the tide of society to recede before she moved. She found Jasper in the orchid wing, his hands folded behind his back, gazing at an illustration of Paphiopedilum parishii, the rare slipper orchid that she had once described as a contradiction in petals. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, letting the silence between them stretch like silk. Then she turned. "I haven't had the chance to ask you yet," she said softly. "What do you think?" He turned to her, eyes warm. "I think the museum is what it was always meant to be." Her gaze held his. "And me?" "You," he said, brushing a thumb across the knuckle of her bare hand, "are what I never dared hope for." Without hesitation, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his in full view of the passing crowd. Gasps could be heard behind them. Society matrons widened their eyes. One journalist scribbled furiously. Juniper raised her chin and asked, in a voice that held centuries of stolen dignity, "Will you walk beside me?" Jasper did not pause. "Always," he said, "and never behind you." And so they walked, side by side, through a corridor of leaves and light, their silhouettes framed by the glowing glass of the greenhouse dome. Two figures once defined by shadows, now basking, unashamed, in the warmth they had built together. The gallery lights shimmered around them like stardust. Juniper's gown whispered over the marble floors. Children waved from the corners. Her illustrations gleamed like stained glass. And Mrs. Clevedon, unnoticed and irrelevant, slipped out the side door with only the echo of applause behind her. The museum had opened. But more than that, Juniper Locke had opened, like the very flowers she had drawn, with ink, with heart, and with her own hard-won light. Spring had come again to London, but it was not the same spring as before. The air was warmer, gentler, as though it too had softened in reverence to the quiet revolution that had unfolded within the stone walls of the Greymont Museum. Magnolia trees blossomed in Kensington's private gardens. Tulips bowed toward the sun outside the museum's entrance, planted by a group of children who now called Juniper Locke their botany mistress. And inside, under vaulted ceilings and galleries pulsing with color and learning, the world she had once imagined in the solitude of ink and paper had fully, gloriously bloomed. It was late afternoon when Juniper returned to the greenhouse. The same greenhouse where nearly a year prior she had first laid eyes on Jasper Redcliffe, not as a nobleman or benefactor, but as a man who saw her. The same place where she had drawn a passion flower by lamplight, unaware that her gaze would meet his across glass panes and ferns. Now that space felt transformed, not merely by new exhibits or improved ventilation, but by something far more elusive: love, tempered by time, and truth. She carried no portfolio today, no satchel of drawings, no scientific journals, only a shawl draped over her shoulders and the quiet hum of contentment woven through her breath. The garden was quiet at this hour, long after the public had left and before the evening staff would arrive. Sunlight streamed through the arched windows in long golden bands, catching dust motes that floated like miniature stars between tropical leaves. Her steps slowed when she reached her desk, a broad oak table once warped by years of neglect, now polished to a warm sheen. Upon its surface, among the familiar arrangements of field notes and dried clippings, lay a single sheet of cream-colored parchment, folded, deliberate, with her name written across it in Jasper's unmistakable hand. She paused, a flicker of breath escaping her lips. Fingertips trembling, Juniper unfolded the sheet. At first, her eyes searched for the familiar legal phrases, the sharp, conditional language that had once defined the strange, cautious beginning of their marriage. But they were gone, all of them. Every clause, every condition, every careful, calculated provision about discretion, propriety, and autonomy had been struck through in a single, elegant gesture. In their place, one line remained. "Whatever you wish to give, I receive with joy." The handwriting was steady. No hesitation in the stroke, no fear, only sincerity. Behind her, she heard the faintest creak of boots on the iron grate walkway. She turned slowly. Jasper stood in the doorway, a silhouette gilded by sunset. He wore no cravat, no waistcoat, only shirt sleeves rolled at the forearm, and a look in his eyes that made her heart ache in ways both old and new. He stepped forward with quiet purpose. "I wasn't sure if you'd find it," he said softly. "I did." "Then let me ask again. Not as a man bound by honor or arrangement, not as a baron, not even as a patron, but simply as a man." He lowered himself to one knee, not with theatrical flourish, not for display, but with reverence. "I love you, Juniper Balogh, not because of what you endured, not in spite of who you are, but because of everything you are. Will you marry me again? Not as a contract, but as a vow freely made." The moment stilled. All the world quieted. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath in the rafters. Juniper's eyes shimmered, not with tears of disbelief or uncertainty, but with clarity. She reached for his hand, pulled him gently to his feet. "I accept," she whispered, her voice rich and unwavering, "not as the woman they once mocked in plum wool, but as the woman I have become, as the woman who stood, who spoke, who loved, and who will never again ask permission to belong." Jasper's hand rose to her cheek, calloused fingers caressing the edge of her jaw, as though committing it to memory. They kissed, not with urgency, but with certainty. Not as strangers drawing tentative breath, but as two souls whose roots had finally intertwined after seasons of wind and doubt. Around them, the greenhouse caught the sunset. Glass petals overhead reflected 1,000 shades of flame and rose. Vines coiled delicately around columns. Blossoms trembled in the evening breeze. The scent of orange blossom and fern mingled in the air, clinging to their clothes like a blessing. Their shadows stretched behind them, tall and side by side. No longer living in half-light, no longer waiting to be chosen. They had chosen each other. Later, as they walked hand in hand through the museum's darkened halls, empty now, sacred in their stillness, Juniper paused beside one of her earliest illustrations. A drawing of Anemone nemorosa, the windflower, fragile, pale, born of woods and shadows. "It's not my best work," she murmured. "It was never about perfection," he said, drawing her close. "It was about truth." She looked at him then, really looked, and realized he was no longer simply the man who had lifted her work from a table to silence a room. He was the man who had learned to listen, who had dared to stand back so she could rise, who had rewritten a contract with ink and faith. Their steps echoed softly through the atrium. Outside, the city shimmered beneath gaslight and stars. Somewhere, a bell tower chimed the hour. The night pressed in like velvet. But inside the museum, the warmth held. They did not speak further. Words were no longer needed. For in that silence, beneath arched glass and the scent of blooming jasmine, two people who had once been strangers under a banner of civility were now husband and wife, not just in name, but in heart. She, the woman of his dreams, and he, the man who finally understood that love does not begin with conquest. It begins with seeing, with listening, and with the courage to rewrite the story. Together, the wisteria bloomed early that year. Its lavender clusters draped over the arches of the Greymont Museum's southern terrace, trailing like silk ribbons down stone columns warmed by morning sun. Bees hummed lazily between blossoms. Laughter drifted from the greenhouse, where a group of children crouched in the soil with small trowels, listening attentively to a tall woman in a faded straw hat and green linen apron. Juniper Balogh, now Lady Redcliffe, though few still called her that, knelt beside a boy with unruly hair and a missing front tooth. She showed him how to gently tuck a sprouting bean vine beneath a bamboo trellis. "No, not too tight," she said with a patient smile. "Let it climb on its own. You're only guiding it, not trapping it." The boy blinked at her, then grinned. Behind her, little footsteps approached. "Mother," said a girl's voice, light and clear. "Ada says the new bees are out. Can we go see?" Juniper turned and reached for the child's hand. At 4 years old, Eleanor Rose Redcliffe bore her mother's long frame and her father's eyes, stormy grey flecked with silver. "Let's finish helping Thomas first," Juniper replied, brushing a lock of earth-brown hair from her daughter's brow. "Then we'll go find the bees. Promise?" Juniper nodded. "Always." From across the lawn, a familiar figure stood watching them. Jasper, older now, though the years had only added softness to his sharpness. The silver at his temples had spread, his shoulders stooped slightly from time spent hunched over ledgers and lecture notes. But his gaze, steady, proud, endlessly tender, had not changed. He carried a satchel of correspondence and wore his reading spectacles slung by a ribbon at his chest. The museum had grown in reputation since its opening. International scholars now walked its halls. New wings had been added, one for rare orchids, another for medicinal herbs. But it was the children's gallery, designed by Juniper, filled with stories, scents and pressed flowers, that remained the beating heart of the institution. Jasper approached them slowly. "Thomas," he said with mock sternness, "have you persuaded your teacher to let you borrow the trowel again?" Thomas flushed crimson. Juniper laughed softly and tousled the boy's hair. "No need for inquiry, my lord," she teased. "We've reached a truce. He digs, I supervise." Jasper extended a hand to Eleanor, who slipped her fingers into his. Together, the family walked toward the bee garden, an idea Juniper had insisted upon after the particularly wet spring of '81. "Pollinators first," she had declared. "Before glory, before design, life must come first." 5 years. 5 years since the trial that exposed Mrs. Clevedon's lies and ended Havisham's ambitions in disgrace. His name no longer appeared in society pages. Rumours placed him in self-imposed exile on the Isle of Wight, where he lectured to half-empty drawing rooms about museum security. As for Clevedon, she had vanished from public life entirely. No scandal, no apology, only silence, a void of her own making. And Juniper, she had not only survived the cruelty of those early years, she had rewritten the script entirely. Her illustrations now graced scientific publications in Berlin, Boston and Kyoto. Her name was whispered with reverence among naturalists, not as a curiosity or a social experiment, but as a pioneer. Yet her proudest creation remained the seed library tucked inside a glass case at the heart of the museum. Each drawer bore the name of a child who had planted, drawn or catalogued a specimen. The final drawer was labelled simply Eleanor Rose. Inside it, a single pressed violet and a note written in her daughter's hand, "For Mother, who sees what others miss." That evening after dinner, Juniper and Jasper sat in the conservatory as shadows lengthened across the tiles. Eleanor was asleep upstairs, her breath soft and even beneath a patchwork quilt sewn by Miss Trenham, who now lived in retirement by the sea, but sent letters weekly. Jasper poured 2 cups of chamomile tea. Juniper rested her bare feet on a velvet footstool, her ankles crossed, a sketchpad forgotten in her lap. "I've been thinking," Jasper said after a pause. "Dangerous," she replied, eyes closed. "Very." He reached into his pocket and retrieved a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, a thin band of ironwood encircled by a single vine of gold. Juniper opened her eyes. "We never had a ring," he said softly. "Only paper and a kiss." She took the ring gently, turned it in her fingers, smiled. "And now we have roots." He slipped it onto her finger, where it fit perfectly. Outside, the wind stirred the wisteria. Inside, the fire crackled low. And in that room, quiet, ordinary, sacred, 2 people who had once built a marriage on terms and silence now sat surrounded by warmth, laughter, and a daughter who would grow up knowing that love was not a favour, nor a performance. It was a garden, tended daily, made strong through storms, and in full bloom. If you've made it to the end of Juniper and Jasper's journey, take a breath and hold it for just a moment, because what you've just witnessed isn't only the tale of a woman who was once mocked in a plum-wool dress. It's the story of anyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or silenced, only to rise, not with noise, but with purpose. Juniper taught us that dignity is not loud, but it is unshakable. That love, when rooted in respect, grows wild and strong. And that sometimes the most unexpected unions are the ones that rewrite the world quietly, one blossom at a time. This story reminds us that healing doesn't come in grand declarations, but in steady hands, open hearts, and the courage to begin again. If this story moved you, if you saw a part of yourself in Juniper or Jasper, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what part of this journey stayed with you. And if you truly made it to the end, write the word wisteria in the comments below. That way, we'll know you walked every step of this path with us. Your words help our channel grow and reach new hearts. If you feel called to support the team behind these deeply emotional period romances, consider sending a super thanks with whatever amount you feel inspired to give. Every contribution, big or small, helps us continue to bring these timeless stories to life. And if that's not possible right now, no worries at all. Simply sharing this story with a friend or loved one is another beautiful way to help. Who knows? Maybe someone you know needs this kind of love story today. Lastly, don't forget to explore the other historical romances we've crafted with just as much care and passion. I've left some favorites for you in the cards at the end of this video. Thank you for walking through this garden of emotion with us. Until our next story, keep your heart open and your soul blooming.